So we're now going to Genevieve Gluck. She's from the USA. She's a feminist researcher and essayist, and she's going to be talking on the links between transgenderism and porn. So welcome, Genevieve, and over to you.
So I'm talking today about gender ideology, pornography, and sex trafficking. And I believe all of these things are linked together and impossible to separate. To begin with the question, why do transactivists, especially men who identify as trans, promote the sex industry? So I have here some common phrases that I'm sure most of us who have been involved in this discussion have heard more than once, multiple times. For example, the trans women are women. This, I think, mirrors a kind of mantra that can be seen in trans pornography, especially a genre called sissy hypno-pornography, where mantras are repeated over and over in order to condition the viewer. I'm speculating that it might be somewhat linked. Of course, there's no way of knowing for sure. Then there's also the sex work is work, which Rachel talked about earlier, how this phrase is so misleading in a similar vein as the trans women are women. And don't kink shame. And of course, swerf and turf, which Julie Bindel pointed out, there's a reason why these two words rhyme. Swerf meaning sex work exclusionary radical feminist, and then of course turf, trans exclusionary. So the mantras trans women are women and sex work is work are similar slogans that are often used in conjunction with each other. Both form a framework for men's sexual entitlement to women and the erosion of our boundaries. The former conditions the mind, while the latter colonizes the body. When taken in their literal meanings, with the disappeared power hierarchy restored, they could more accurately be expressed as men are more oppressed than women, and therefore men have a right to pay to rape women. So it's my view that men who identify as transgender are engaging in at least one sexual fetish, which is sometimes called a paraphilia, namely transvestic fetishism. Fetishes are overwhelmingly a male phenomenon and tend to overlap. If you have one, there's a likelihood that you might have another corresponding paraphilia. And in the sex trafficking industry, these men find their ultimate validation as a female because they view women as sex objects and eroticize our subordinate status. I'm going to briefly talk about each of these three avenues through which this idea is promoted, first starting with academia, and then social media and pornography, and then finally the lobbying for the sex trafficking industry. Beginning with sissy porn. This is a quote from Andrea Long Chu, who's an American academic who attended Columbia University. And this was a book published by, I believe, a UK publisher, Verso Press, called Females. And he describes sissy porn as something which literally turns a male viewer into a female through feminization. And as you can see here, it says feminized and forced to wear makeup, wear lingerie, and perform acts of sexual submission. He goes on to say that the asshole is the universal vagina. Basically, he reduces women down to an act of sex and then finishes this thought by saying that sissy porn did make him trans. By the way, I forgot to mention, yes, there is some adult language that I'll be using, and there will be some sexualized imagery. I reduced it, to the best of my ability, but some of it will be present, so just be aware. And here's one more quote from Chu, which says that pornography is the quintessential expression of femaleness. As I'll point out, he's not alone in this thinking. He presented these ideas at several reputable universities in the US. UC Berkeley, Vassar College is a women's only university, and he was invited to Vassar College by the feminist organization on campus. Also, he presented this at UCLA and at Columbia. Here's another academic by the name of Astrid Gilbert, who writes for a US publication called Transgender Studies Quarterly, and they're published by Duke University Press. So for those who aren't familiar, Duke University is a very highly esteemed university. And I'm pointing this out because you can see here that he is working in the area of porn studies. So that's something that's emerging in US universities increasingly, and I find it very difficult to track because you basically have to go through a university website's curriculum to find that they're doing this. For example, this is from the Australian National University website. This is posted on their website. A PhD study of transgender porn industry for the field of anthropology. This trans-identified male went to the US to study pornography in Las Vegas for a PhD. This is from that article describing what it is this person, Sophie, is doing in Las Vegas. Walking the red carpet for the Academy Awards, attend pornography film shoots, go to industry conventions and parties. Sophie says that he believes his work follows in the feminist tradition of consciousness raising to bring trans issues beyond academia. And then this quote, which really stood out to me, where Sophie describes abusive behavior on the set of a porn shoot in what's called Porn Valley in California, the San Fernando Valley. And really just the attitude here that it's just part of the job. This is another academic, Grace Levery, who teaches English at UC Berkeley. This is a quote from him that says, "There is something about being treated like shit by men that feels like affirmation itself, like a cry of delight from the deepest cavern of my breast. To be the victim of honest, undisguised sexism possesses an exhilarating vitality." And he spoke at Berkeley. The title of this presentation, "The King's Two Anuses," I don't know what this was about. There's no video that I can find of it, but I just speculated on, Andrea Long Chu's kind of definition of women, if it had something to do with that, who is also mentioned here in his tweet. And this is from the curriculum where he tweeted it publicly, so you can see it's publicly available. He uses pornography in the classroom, teaching sissy porn to the university students, as well as other literature that's related on that topic. I don't know why an English teacher would be teaching these kinds of things, but there you have it. This is Jacob Tobia, who also is an author, wrote a book called Sissy, which is a memoir. And this quote here that I have is not from the book. It's actually from the Playboy website, where he had an interview with Playboy, which mysteriously seems to have been taken down. But this is a quote from that interview, which says, "Women around the world have been treated as sexual objects. Yet if sexual objectification is so categorically awful, then why do I want it so badly? I want to be sexually objectified. The idea that being seen as a sex object is universally a bad thing is too simple, like many tenets of feminism." And before COVID happened in 2019, it was announced that Showtime would be turning this book into a series. No word yet if that's still going through, but. So in terms of pornography, now moving on from academia and authors, the term transgender in 2018 was the 5th most popular search on Pornhub. However, I want to point out that these days, pornography has kind of infiltrated social media. A recent study that was just published, I think this month, about a week ago or something, from the City University of London found that the majority of teenagers surveyed were accessing pornography through social media rather than dedicated pornography websites, which represents a kind of a fundamental shift. It really limits our ability to track these kinds of things. Okay, so sorry about this. This is where the not safe for work content comes in, but there are these things on social media called captions. So they're called TG captions for transgender or sissy captions. The image on the left is from Instagram, and it's an example of that. It's an example of what would probably be called like forced feminization pornography, where in theory, the man is being forced to become a woman and forced to take hormones. However, they always use images of real women in these captions. I've never once seen a change to that. And then here we have a tweet where they're basically saying that their dream is to be pimped out. And maybe you also notice the racial element here as well. That's another part of it. And a couple more of these kinds of things, like these captions where they're basically equating being sold with womanhood. You can see that they use the trans flag colors here as well. And in addition to fetishizing being sex trafficked, they might also fetishize pregnancy or becoming a wife, anything that they see to be quote unquote feminine or humiliating. On Reddit, there are these forums, lots and lots and lots of them, where they talk about these kinds of practices and exchange information. Just to point out here, the correlation between cissi and trans. Sometimes if you try to talk about this with people, they might say, that there's a difference. One is a fetishist, not real, not truly a trans person. However, the overlap is quite huge, and they will even fetishize the act of taking hormones. I've seen testimonies in these forums of people saying that watching pornography made them start taking hormones and things like this. Instagram has started to limit these hashtags, which is the only social media site that I see doing this. These kinds of things are all over Twitter, Reddit, basically every major social media outlet. This is from a Reddit forum for men who are trying to recover from this addiction, where they'll openly say things that I think are quite honest about trying to escape it, trying to recover. That porn addiction caused them to question their gender identity or to develop certain sexual practices. So why is this relevant to sex trafficking? Well, the trans rights terminology is being used as a guise to promote full decriminalization. I'm speaking specifically now in the US. I believe it's happening in other countries as well, but for the best of my knowledge, I'm focusing on this. For example, the ACLU often promotes the full decriminalization on the basis of trans rights. Last month, a New York City judge dismissed thousands of prostitution cases, and this is, yes, in effect, this is a very good thing. We want this, right? However, I'm critical of this because it was only addressed after 8 males who identify as transgender filed a lawsuit. So this law had been in place where police could arrest women on suspicion of prostitution. Since 1976, it wasn't really, nothing was really been done about it until it was relabeled as a walking while trans law. And then suddenly there was a lot of motivation to get this law repealed. This is from the news article. Okay, so this is Cecilia Gentili, a trans-identified male who is a committee member of Decrim NY, which is calling for the full decriminalization of the sex industry in New York State. They're currently having a moment right now where they're trying to decide whether to go with the Nordic model or for full decriminalization. And his organization is very much for the latter. As you can see here, tweeting out the mantra again and advocating for full decriminalization. And Gentili has the ear of politicians, unfortunately, women politicians who are on the left, who are Democratic, who are supporting this move towards full decriminalization. Another example of a trans-identified male in in politics who is advocating such similar policy is Antonella Lerca, who last year ran for public office in Romania, in Bucharest, on a full decriminalization platform. This image of him here on the right, not yours to objectify, I think kind of speaks volumes here. And the trafficking of Romanian women into the UK and into Europe in general has become such a severe issue that politicians are seeking to address it specifically. So here we have Antonella Lerca trying to decriminalize the industry, while on the other hand, you have, Scotland and other countries trying to get this in check. The Romanian human trafficking rings target teenage girls. They abduct them sometimes, or groom them, and traffic them in terrible conditions. And the profit here is huge with the selling of these girls. So no consideration, as usual, for the actual reality of women and girls who are involved or who are enslaved by this industry. Your viewers might be familiar with Munra Bergdorf, who also advocates for full decriminalization. Bergdorf posed in Playboy magazine with the title, What Munra Bergdorf Can Teach Us About Womanhood. And my comment on this is that gender ideology seeks to instruct and redirect women back into their prescribed roles as subordinate sex objects, and men who appropriate our identity are eager to be objectified. Julia Serrano is an American writer who, this book, Whipping Girl, when it came out in 2007, was widely praised by feminist organizations. And in this chapter, which I believe was called Submissive Fantasies, I think, of this book, he talks about fantasizing abduction, forced feminization, humiliation as being the ultimate form of pleasure, to be viewed as a woman in sex slavery, he describes as his ultimate fantasy. Along the same vein, Janet Mock, another famous American trans activist, who describes teen sex trafficking as an underground railroad. For those who aren't familiar, the Underground Railroad is a reference to an anti-slavery movement in US history. So comparing teen sex trafficking to the Underground Railroad here, saying that this underground railroad of resources created by Women enabled me when I was 16 to jump in a car and choose a pathway to my survival and liberation. This is a reference to sex trafficking. And so as a result of this kind of activism, this need to be seen as liberal and progressive in the US, you have magazines that are aimed at teenage girls advocating the idea that it's liberating for them to be sold. There are also these kinds of manuals and books that you can find on Amazon that are basically transgender erotica of forced feminization. This is an example of one of them describing being sold and being pimped as a sexual fantasy. And the American Human Rights Campaign in 2016 published a PDF on their website prescribing certain language that would be more inclusive. These are some of those terms. The term that they prescribe for women here, front hole, is a term found in FTM pornography. The statistics that are often used to portray an epidemic of violence against trans-identified males are overwhelmingly from Brazil, a country where the sex industry is thriving and also targets men who identify as transgender by promising to fund their surgery. Of course, as we know, there's no way to make the sex trafficking industry safe. It's inherently violent, it's inherently dangerous, and a majority even of the American men who identify as transgender were killed in the sex industry. So it doesn't make any sense that they would be promoting this if they actually had anyone's interest at heart, much less women's. And of course, prostitution is akin to slavery. As I said, cannot be made safe, can only be abolished. There are differing numbers of estimates. Of course, it's an illegal industry, so the numbers will vary, but basically estimates are around 96% to 99% of those trafficked are female. So in addition to being an exploitative industry, it also promotes the view that women are disposable objects for male use. Studies of men who buy sex or buy women who are also called punters show that they are more likely than other men to rape and engage in all forms of violence against women. A US study found that they were nearly 8 times more likely to rape than other men. We can see that again here with the 2016 UN study that men who engage in the purchasing of women's bodies are more likely to be violent and more likely to have criminal behavior. Those who vocalize concerns and criticisms about gender ideology often claim that it reduces women to stereotypes. While this is true, I believe it goes much further. Gender ideology and men who appropriate a female identity reduce women to sexual objects and fantasies of sexual submissiveness. Advocates of gender ideology, especially the MTF, promote the normalization of the sex industry because it validates their definition of woman as sex object and allows them to fund their plastic surgery and hormones. It's not possible to separate gender ideology from pornography and the sex industry. Gender ideologues base their views of women on pornography and are actively promoting these views in media, books, and in universities. We must not shy away from calling this what it is, a movement founded on the objectification of women and male entitlement to our bodies and our minds, which splinters women into consumable and commodifiable parts for men to fetishize and own.